Alora Voss drove the shovel into the cracked earth one last time and didn't cry. She had no tears left. 3 days without water will do that to a woman. She packed the dirt flat with her bare hands, pressed her palm against the mound, and whispered her husband's name once, just once, then picked up the flour sack she'd been dragging for 40 miles and kept walking. She didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth looking at anymore. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel right now and follow Alora's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next at the Hale Ranch will change everything you think you know about a woman's worth. The flour sack weighed 11 pounds when she started. By the time the Hale Ranch fence line came into view on the 4th day, it felt like 60. Alora Voss was 28 years old, 5'4" and wide in the hips and shoulders, in a way that made smaller women look away when she passed. She had dark hair plastered to the back of her neck from the August heat, blistered feet wrapped in strips torn from her husband's old work shirt, and a jaw set so hard it ached. She had nothing else. Not a coin, not a horse. Not a soul in the world who was expecting her anywhere. She stopped at the fence post and looked at the ranch spread out ahead of her. It was bigger than she'd imagined from the description in town, the one the mercantile owner's wife had given her in a whisper, like she was passing along a warning instead of directions. 2 barns, a long cookhouse set apart from the main house, a bunkhouse with a crooked chimney, fields running out to the east still yellow from the summer drought, and the main house itself, 2 stories unpainted timber, a porch that wrapped around the front and disappeared around the side. Solid, undecorated, built by a man who didn't care what anything looked like, only whether it held. Garrick Hale. She'd heard the name twice before she worked up the nerve to walk toward the property. Both times the person saying it lowered their voice. Hard man, the woman at the mercantile had said. Lost his wife 8 years ago. Runs that ranch like a military operation. Doesn't take kindly to strangers, doesn't socialize, doesn't attend church. His ranch hands stay because he pays fair and doesn't cheat them, not because they like him. Is he a cruel man? Alora had asked. The woman had thought about it. Not cruel, just cold, like a well in January, deep and useful and completely unbothered by whether you're comfortable. Alora had thanked her and walked out of the mercantile without buying anything because she had no money, and the woman had watched her go with an expression that mixed pity and relief in equal measure. Pity for where Alora was headed, relief that she herself was not. Now Alora stood at the fence and looked at the main house and told herself she was not afraid. She was not afraid. She was just very, very tired, and her feet hurt, and she had approximately 2 days of body reserves left before her legs would stop working reliably, and the nearest town was 20 miles back, and she had nowhere else to go. She pushed through the gate. A ranch hand spotted her before she made it halfway across the yard. Young man, maybe 19, with red hair and a look of absolute bewilderment crossing his face as he watched a large dust-covered woman carrying a flour sack walk steadily toward the main house like she owned it. "Ma'am," he called out, jogging toward her. "Ma'am, this is private property." "I'm aware of that," Alora said without slowing down. "I'm looking for Mr. Hale." "Mr. Hale he doesn't take visitors, ma'am." "I'm not a visitor. I'm a cook." The young man stopped jogging and stared at her. "We already have a cook." "No, you don't," Alora said. "You have a man named Pete who burns beans and waters down the coffee, and your ranch hands have been eating hardtack 3 days a week because nobody wants to be the one to tell Mr. Hale that Pete quit 2 weeks ago and rode east." She said it calmly, like she was reading off a list. "The woman at the mercantile told me. She said 3 of your hands came in last Tuesday buying dried beef with their own money because they couldn't stomach what was coming out of the cookhouse." The young man's mouth opened and closed. "How did you? Word travels. Are you going to take me to Mr. Hale or not?" He took her to Mr. Hale. Garrick Hale was in the far barn when they found him standing over a work table, examining a length of fence wire with the focused expression of a man who had a great many problems and was currently choosing to concentrate on the smallest one. He was taller than Alora expected. Lean not in the wiry way of underfed men, but in the way of someone who burned through everything he consumed and never stopped moving. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that had been outside in every kind of weather for 20 years. His eyes, when he looked up, were the flat gray of creek water in November. He looked at the red-haired boy first, then at Alora. His expression didn't change. "Dawson," he said to the boy, "explain." "She walked in through the front gate, sir. Says she's a cook. Says she knows Pete left." Garrick Hale looked at Alora for a long moment. She looked back. She had decided in the final 50 yards before the barn that she would not drop her eyes first, would not fidget with the flour sack, would not explain herself nervously the way women were expected to when they wanted something from a man like this. She just stood there and waited. "Pete left," Garrick said. It wasn't a question. "3 weeks ago," Alora said. "Based on what I heard in town." 2.5 weeks ago, Garrick said, his jaw tightened slightly. "Who told you in town?" "Woman at the mercantile. She didn't mean to. She was trying to talk me out of coming here and mentioned that your current situation was already bad enough without adding—" Alora paused. "Without adding me to it." Something shifted in Garrick's face. Not amusement exactly. More like the faintest acknowledgement that she'd said something accurate. "She's not wrong. Maybe not. But you don't have a cook, Mr. Hale, and I need work. I can cook for 9 men. I can cook for 12 if I need to. I can manage a kitchen, keep a pantry plan for a month at a stretch. I know canning, curing, smoking, and I can stretch a food budget further than anyone you've hired before." She set the flour sack down on the barn floor. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for the job." Garrick looked at the flour sack, then back at her. "Where'd you come from?" "Harlan Creek." "That's 40 miles. "I'm aware of that." "You walked 40 miles." "I did." He was quiet for a moment. The barn around them smelled of hay and iron, and the particular warm animal smell of horses on a hot day. One of the horses in the stalls shifted its weight. Outside, someone was hammering something rhythmically. "What happened to your husband?" Garrick asked. His voice was flat, not cruel the way a man sounds when he's learned that flat questions get straighter answers. Alora felt the question land in her chest the way it always did, like a stone dropped into still water. "He died. Fever. 3 weeks ago." "Children?" "No." "Family?" "None within reach." Garrick looked at her for another long moment. His eyes moved across her, not the way men's eyes sometimes moved across women with that particular sliding assessment she'd learned to brace for, but the way a man looks at a situation he's trying to solve. Practical. Appraising. "You're asking me to take in a widow I don't know, house her on my property, and put her in charge of feeding 9 men. In exchange for fair wages and a place to sleep, yes. What if you can't handle it?" Alora reached into the flour sack and pulled out the only thing she'd carried for 40 miles, besides a change of clothing and her husband's Bible. It was a small battered notebook, its cover soft with handling, the pages dense with handwriting. She held it out to him. "This is 6 years of recipes, meal plans, and supply lists. Every ranch I've cooked for, every number of men I've fed, every adjustment I made for drought season, winter, harvest time. You can look through it if you want. Or you can take my word. Either way, your men are hungry, and I'm standing in your barn." Garrick didn't take the notebook. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at young Dawson, who had been standing to the side with the expression of someone watching a situation he didn't fully understand, but was finding deeply interesting. "Dawson," Garrick said, "show her the cookhouse." Alora put the notebook back in the flour sack. "Mrs. Voss," Garrick said, and his voice stopped her. She turned. His eyes were level and entirely without warmth, but there was something in them, not unkindness, but a kind of honesty, that she found she preferred to the alternative. "You're here because I need a cook, and you walked 40 miles, and that tells me you're serious. That's all it tells me. Don't make more of it than it is." "I won't," Alora said. "Good." She followed Dawson out of the barn. The cookhouse was a disaster. She stood in the doorway for a full 30 seconds and just looked at it. The stove had a rust bloom spreading from the left burner across the front plate, like a slow fire frozen in iron. The work table was sticky. The shelves were a chaos of unlabeled tins, mismatched crockery, and what appeared to be 3 different incomplete sets of cutlery, all jumbled together in a clay pot. There was a smell not quite rotten, but moving in that direction, coming from somewhere she couldn't identify. The window over the basin had a crack in it stuffed with a rag. Dawson stood behind her, apologetic without speaking. "How long has it been like this?" Alora asked. "Pete wasn't much for cleaning," Dawson said carefully. "I can see that. Has Mr. Hale been in here recently?" "Mr. Hale doesn't come to the cookhouse." Alora turned and looked at him. "Ever?" Dawson shook his head. "Not that I've seen. He eats what gets brought to the main house usually. Or he doesn't eat. Sometimes he just doesn't eat." Alora thought about that. She thought about a man who ran a ranch this size and couldn't be bothered to notice that his cookhouse had turned into a health concern because he'd arranged his life so that he never had to come near it. "Where do I sleep?" she asked. There was a small room off the back of the cookhouse, barely larger than a closet really, with a cot and a wooden hook on the wall and a window the size of a Bible. Dawson showed it to her with the air of a man bracing for a complaint. "This is fine," Alora said. He blinked. "It is. It has a door that locks and a roof without holes. That's fine." She set the flour sack on the cot. "I need a full inventory of what's in this cookhouse and what's in whatever food stores Mr. Hale keeps. I need hot water and soap, and I need to know what time the men expect their evening meal." 6 o'clock. Alora looked at the small clock on the shelf, the one clean thing in the room she noticed, which told her something about Pete's priorities. It was 2:15. "Then I have time," she said. "Go tell whoever needs telling that supper will be ready at 6. Real supper, not hardtack." Dawson grinned the sudden unguarded grin of someone who'd been eating very badly for several weeks, and had just been offered a way out of it, and disappeared. Alora turned back to the cookhouse, pushed up her sleeves, and started with the stove. She worked for 4 hours without stopping. The rust on the stove front was surface only. She scraped it back with a knife she found in the jumbled cutlery and treated what she could reach with a cloth soaked in the vinegar she found in one of the unlabeled tins. The smell turned out to be a crock of lard, left too long in a warm corner. She disposed of it, opened the window despite the cracked glass, and let the August heat do the work of moving the air through. The shelves she pulled apart completely, wiping each one down, grouping what she found by type and quantity in her head first, then by placement staples at eye-level seasonings within reach of the stove. The things she wouldn't need daily pushed to the back and up high. By 5 o'clock, she had an inventory. She wasn't happy about. The flour was low. The salt pork was sufficient but not generous, and whoever had been ordering dried goods had been doing it without any plan beyond getting through the next week. But it was workable. She had enough. At 5:30, she had cornbread baking and a pot of beans on, with the salt pork and onions, and a second pot going with the rest of the beef she'd found in the cold storage. Not much, but enough that every man at the table would have a proper portion. She made a gravy from the drippings. She set the table herself, pulling the cutlery out of the clay pot and sorting it properly and laying it straight. At 6 o'clock, the ranch hands filed in. They came the way men come to a table. They've learned not to expect much from not quite reluctantly, but without anticipation, the way you walk toward something, because you have to, not because you want to. There were 9 of them. They ranged from Dawson's 19 to a weathered man with white in his beard who looked to be close to 60. They saw the table laid properly. They smelled the beans and the cornbread and the beef gravy. 3 of them stopped in the doorway like they'd run into an invisible wall. "Sit down," Alora said from the stove without turning around. "There's enough for everyone." There was a long pause. Then the sound of boots on the plank floor and the scrape of chairs. She served them herself, ladling the beans, setting the cornbread in a cloth-lined basket, so it stayed warm, bringing the beef and gravy around in the pot so every man could take what he needed. She poured the coffee herself, too strong and black, and nothing like the thin gray water Pete had apparently been producing. Nobody said much while they ate. But the silence was different from the silence of men being polite. It was the silence of men eating seriously with attention, the way people eat when food is actually good. The man with the white beard, she'd learned his name was Calhoun, and he'd been on the Hale Ranch longer than any other. Hand looked up from his plate partway through the meal and fixed her with a look that had nothing of pity in it and everything of assessment. "Where'd you train?" he asked. "Trained myself," Alora said. "Started cooking for crews when I was 17. Ranches. Mostly. Some trail work." Calhoun looked at his plate, looked up again. "This is better than what we were getting before, Pete." "I'll take that as a compliment," Alora said. "It is one," Calhoun said, and went back to eating. She was washing the last of the pots when she heard boots on the cookhouse step, heavier than the ranch hands, with a different cadence. Unhurried, and then Garrick Hale was in the doorway. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the cookhouse itself, at the clean shelves, the sorted stores, the stove front with the worst of the rust scraped back, the table wiped down and properly set, even now that the meal was done. "Calhoun told me supper was ready," he said. "I'd have brought a plate to the main house," Alora said. "I didn't know your preference." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll eat here." She looked at him. He was still looking at the room, not at her. She couldn't read his expression well enough yet to know what he was thinking, but she noticed that something in the set of his shoulders had shifted slightly, not softened exactly, but rearranged the way a man's posture changes when a problem he'd been calculating around has been removed. She filled a plate and set it on the end of the table nearest the door. The seat she'd already learned where a man who doesn't commit to staying sits, and went back to the last pot. He sat, he ate. He didn't compliment the food, but he cleaned the plate and he refilled his coffee once without asking. Just reaching for the pot, the way a man does in a kitchen where he's comfortable, and when he stood to leave, he paused in the doorway for a moment, in the way of someone who's about to say something and decides not to. 6 o'clock, Alora said without looking up from the pot. He paused. "What?" "Breakfast, 6 o'clock. If that doesn't suit, tell me now." Another pause. Longer. She kept her eyes on the pot. "6 o'clock is fine," Garrick Hale said, and walked out into the August dark. Alora finished the last pot, dried her hands on the cloth, and went to the small room off the back. She sat on the cot for the first time since she'd set her flour sack on it 4 hours ago. The room was barely large enough to turn around in. The window let in a square of purple evening sky. Somewhere out in the yard, one of the horses was moving in its stall, that rhythmic, comfortable sound of an animal settling for the night. She opened her husband's Bible not to read it, just to hold it the way she'd done every night for 3 weeks, and sat with it in her lap until her shoulders stopped shaking. Then she laid it on the floor beside the cot, lay down fully clothed, and was asleep before the sky outside went black. She had a job. She had a roof. She had work she knew how to do, and work enough of it to fill every hour between now and whatever came next. For Alora Voss, for the first time in 3 weeks, that was enough. The morning after her first night at the Hale Ranch, Alora was at the stove before 5. She hadn't slept past 4:30 in years, not since her first ranch job at 17, when the foreman had made it clear that a cook who wasn't up before the crew was a cook who wasn't needed, and her body had simply kept that schedule the way a clock keeps time without being asked. She built the fire in the stove from the kindling she'd stacked the night before, got the coffee going, and started on biscuits, while the dark outside the cookhouse window was still absolute. By the time the first gray light came through the cracked glass, she had biscuits in the oven, salt pork sliced and laid in the pan, and a pot of oats on the back burner with dried apple, and a scrape of the last of the brown sugar she'd found pushed to the very back of the highest shelf. Not much sugar. Enough. Dawson was the first one through the door at 10 minutes to 6, still pulling his suspenders up, and he stopped dead when the smell hit him. "Lord," he said. "Sit down," Alora said. Are those biscuits?" "They will be in 8 minutes. Sit down." He sat. The others came in ones and twos over the next 10 minutes, each of them doing some version of what Dawson had done, stopping, registering the smell, recalibrating whatever they'd been expecting. Calhoun came in last, hat already on, and took his seat at the far end of the table without a word, but Alora caught him looking at the biscuit pan with an expression that on a less weathered face would have been called hopeful. She fed them. It was a real breakfast, not the kind that fills a gap, but the kind that sets a man up for 12 hours of physical work, which was what they needed and what she knew how to provide. When the last man pushed back his chair and headed for the door, Calhoun stayed a moment longer than the others. "You know anything about the supply situation?" he asked. "Not unfriendly. Careful." "I know it's not good," Alora said. "Flour's low. Salt pork will last another 2 weeks if I'm careful. After that we need a trip to town." Calhoun nodded slowly. Pete didn't order regular, just bought what he needed when someone else was making the trip anyway. "That's an expensive way to do it." "Yes, it is," Calhoun said. "Mr. Hale doesn't know the details. Pete handled it, and Mr. Hale paid what was asked and didn't question." Alora looked at him. There was something he was telling her underneath what he was saying, and she took a moment to make sure she was reading it right. "You're telling me the supply account is probably a mess." "I'm telling you Pete wasn't dishonest exactly, just not careful." "I'll need to look at the account book." "You'll need to ask Mr. Hale for it." She asked Mr. Hale for it that morning, finding him at the fence line east of the main barn, where 2 of the hands were repairing a section that had gone down in the night. She walked out to him directly the way she'd decided she would approach everything on this ranch, without circling, without softening, without performing the particular kind of smallness that some men expected from women who needed things from them. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I need the supply account book." He was looking at the fence repair. He didn't look at her. "Why?" "Because I need to know what's been spent, what's been ordered, and what the arrangement is with the supplier in town. I can't plan properly without it." Now he looked at her. The morning light was different from the barn light of the day before, harder, more revealing, and she could see the lines in his face more clearly. The permanent squint from years of looking into sun and distance. The set of his jaw that she was already learning meant he was thinking rather than refusing. "Pete managed the supplies," he said. "Pete's gone," Alora said. "I'll manage them now, but I need the book." A long moment. Then, "Come to the main house after the noon meal." She came to the main house after the noon meal. It was her first time through the front door, and she paid attention the way she always paid attention to new spaces, not admiringly, but practically cataloging what she saw. The main room was large and almost entirely functional. A work table, a desk, 2 chairs that faced the fireplace, bookshelves along one wall, filled with ledgers and bound volumes that looked like land records and livestock accounts. No decorations that she could identify as chosen rather than inherited. No softness anywhere. The house of a man who had stripped everything down to what he needed and stopped there. Garrick Hale was at the desk. He had the supply account book already out and open, which meant he'd looked at it before she arrived, which meant he already knew what was in it. She sat in the chair across the desk without being invited to, and looked at the book. He turned to face her. It was bad. Not catastrophically bad, but bad in the quiet, accumulating way of something that had been mismanaged for a long time by someone who wasn't paying attention. Irregular orders. Prices that varied wildly between purchases of the same goods. Gaps where no ordering had been done for 6-7 weeks at a stretch, followed by rushed purchases at poor prices. "How long was Pete here?" Alora asked. 4 years. She did the arithmetic silently. 4 years of this. She kept her face even. "What's the monthly budget for provisions?" he told her. She kept her face even about that too, though it was lower than it should have been for 9 men doing the kind of physical work ranch hands did. "I can work with this," she said. "But I'll need to renegotiate with the supplier in town. And I'll need to make the orders myself, not go through whoever's making a trip and happens to stop. You want to go to town? I want to place orders with a consistent supplier at a consistent price and have them delivered on a schedule, once a month at minimum, twice during winter prep." Garrick looked at her. Something in his expression was shifting very slightly, the way ice shifts at the beginning of a thaw, not breaking, just moving, settling into a different position. You've done this before. For 6 years. Different operations, different sizes. The principles don't change. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned the book back toward himself and picked up his pen and wrote something at the top of the next blank page. He turned it back to her. It was a name, Thomas Briggs General Supply, and a number she understood was a credit line. Use this, he said. You're authorized. Alora looked at the page. Then she looked at him. He had just handed her authority over a significant portion of his operating budget on the basis of 4 days' acquaintance and 2 meals. She wasn't sure what to do with that, whether it was trust or simply efficiency, or the particular pragmatism of a man who had decided a problem was no longer his to manage and was moving on. I'll have a supply plan to you by the end of the week, she said. He nodded once and looked back at his own papers. She was being dismissed. She stood, picked up the account book, and was at the door when he spoke again. Mrs. Voss. She stopped. The men are working better today, he said. He wasn't looking at her. Calhoun told me. Said they ate a real breakfast and it made a difference. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. Garrick Hale had apparently said the thing he wanted to say and was done. I'll tell Calhoun you noticed, Alora said and walked out. She spent that afternoon at the cookhouse table with the account book and her own notebook open side by side, building a supply plan the way she'd built supply plans for a dozen operations over 6 years. It was the kind of work she was built for, the careful arithmetic of need versus budget, the adjustments for season and crew size, and the particular demands of heavy physical labor, the anticipation of what would be needed in November when she'd need to think about it now in August. She wrote it out in the clean, even hand she'd taught herself years ago, because a supply plan nobody else could read was only as good as its author. She was so deep in those numbers that she almost missed the sound at the cookhouse door. Almost. It was a knock. Not the knock of the ranch hands, who had stopped knocking after the first morning, and simply came in, but a sharper knock with an edge to it. She looked up. A woman stood in the cookhouse doorway. 40, maybe a little older, with the expensive clothes of a town woman, and the expression of someone who had walked into a space she considered beneath her and was making sure everyone knew it. You're the new cook, the woman said. I am, Alora said. I'm Margaret Aldwell. My husband owns the dry goods operation in Crestfield. She stepped into the cookhouse without being asked, which told Alora something. She looked around the room with the particular assessment of someone who had expected to find a mess and was mildly irritated to find it clean. I heard Garrick had taken in a widow. Alora set down her pen. He hired a cook. Yes. Margaret Aldwell smiled in a way that had no warmth in it. Well, that's a generous way to describe it. Her eyes moved over Alora with the kind of thoroughness that was meant to be felt, and it was. You walked here, I heard. From Harlan Creek. I did. 40 miles. The smile stayed. That's quite a walk for a woman in your condition. The word hung in the air between them, and Alora understood exactly what condition meant, and exactly what Margaret Aldwell intended her to understand. She had heard variations of it her whole life, spoken in exactly that tone. The polite word, doing impolite work, the smile that made it impossible to object without seeming oversensitive. She had been 23 before she'd stopped letting it land. I have a strong constitution, Alora said pleasantly. What can I do for you, Mrs. Aldwell? Margaret Aldwell's smile tightened slightly. She had come, she said, to discuss the Harvest Social, the annual gathering that the Hale Ranch hosted for the surrounding homesteads and ranches each September, and which Garrick Hale had apparently been persuaded to maintain even after his wife's death, because canceling it would have required a social interaction he didn't want to have. Mrs. Aldwell was on the organizing committee, she explained. She wanted to know what the cookhouse could contribute. What she actually wanted, Alora understood clearly within the first 2 minutes, was to assess the situation. To look at Garrick Hale's new cook, the large widow who had walked 40 miles and installed herself on the ranch, and decide what she represented and whether it was a problem. We can provide bread, preserves, and whatever's ready from the garden, Alora said. I'll have a better sense of the garden's yield by the end of the week. The garden, Margaret Aldwell repeated. Garrick hasn't had a functioning garden since... She stopped. Since Eleanor. Eleanor. That was the wife's name. 8 years dead and still present enough in this woman's sentence that she'd had to stop herself from finishing it. The garden was neglected, Alora agreed. I've been working on it. Something shifted in Margaret Aldwell's face. Something that crossed from condescension into something more complicated, and then was quickly smoothed back. She left shortly after with the air of someone who had gathered the information she came for and would be reporting it to interested parties. Alora watched her go from the cookhouse doorway and then went back to her supply plan. She didn't mention the visit to Garrick Hale. It wasn't his business. But she thought about it while she worked about the way Margaret Aldwell's eyes had moved around the room, looking for evidence of something. And about the name Eleanor that she'd half said and pulled back, and about the 8 years that had passed since that name had been in regular use on this ranch. 8 years was a long time for a house to go cold. 3 days later, she found the garden's worst problem, and it had nothing to do with neglect. She'd been working the south end of the kitchen garden in the early mornings before breakfast, pulling what had gone past saving and assessing what could be turned around. And she'd been making progress slow, methodical progress, of the kind that gardens required, and that she didn't mind. But on the third morning, she found the south fence section had been pulled loose from the posts, and something deer most likely had gotten in overnight and taken a significant portion of what she'd been cultivating. She stood there in the early morning looking at the damage and did the arithmetic in her head. Lost time. Lost produce. And the fence had been poorly constructed in the first place. She could see that now the posts not sunk deep enough, the wire not properly secured. She fixed it herself. She found the post driver in the tool shed dugout. The posts resunk them at the right depth, restretched the wire, secured it properly. It took 3 hours. Her shoulders ached badly by the end, and she'd blistered both palms in 2 new places, but the fence held when she tested it. She was gathering the tools to put them back when she heard boots behind her and turned. It was Calhoun. He was looking at the fence, then at her hands, then back at the fence. "You did that yourself," he said. "The deer got in," Alora said. "The posts weren't deep enough." Calhoun was quiet for a moment. He pushed his hat back on his head, a gesture she was learning meant he was genuinely surprised about something and was taking a moment to adjust. "I could have sent one of the boys." "You could have," Alora said. "But they're fixing the east pasture water line today, and this needed doing now." Calhoun looked at the fence again. He walked over and gripped the top wire and put weight on it, testing it the way a man tests a thing he didn't believe would hold. It held easily. He looked at her. "Mrs. Voss," he said, and there was something different in his voice now, something that hadn't been there before, even when he'd complimented the beans on her first night. "How long did you say you'd been doing this kind of work?" "Cooking 6 years." "Not just cooking," Calhoun said. She looked at him. "As long as I can remember," she said simply. He nodded once slowly. Then he picked up the post driver she'd left on the ground and carried it back to the tool shed without being asked. Garrick Hale heard about the fence from Calhoun that evening. She knew because she saw the 2 men talking near the water trough, Calhoun doing more of the talking than usual, Garrick listening with his arms crossed and his face in that considering expression. And afterward, Garrick came to the cookhouse door. She was at the stove. "The fence," he said. She didn't turn around. "It's fixed." "Calhoun said you resunk the posts." "They weren't deep enough." A pause. "That's not your job." "The garden is my job," Alora said. "Everything that affects the garden is my job." She turned then because she wanted to see his face when she said the next part. "Unless you want to tell me different." He didn't tell her different. He stood in the doorway for a moment. That pause she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant he was making a decision, and then he said, "I'll have Dawson put in proper fence posts on the north side too. It's been needing it." "That would help," Alora said. He left. She turned back to the stove. She was still not sure what to make of Garrick Hale. He was not what she'd expected. Not the cruel man the mercantile woman had implied. Not the cold, indifferent rancher the gossip had assembled. He was something more specific and more complicated than either of those. A man who had built his life around control and competence, and who responded. She was learning to those same qualities in others, with something that wasn't quite warmth, but was something. A recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of a craftsman seeing another craftsman's work and understanding what it cost. She didn't need his approval. She had never needed any man's approval. But she found turning it over in her mind that night on the cot in the small room that she did not mind his recognition. That it was different from approval in a way she could not quite put words to. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle into night, the horses, the distant sounds of the bunkhouse, the wind off the prairie, and thought that this was, despite everything, a place she could do good work. And doing good work had always been enough for Elora Voss. She told herself that. She almost believed it. The harvest social came on the second Saturday of September, and Elora had been preparing for it for 11 days. She'd made her list the morning after Margaret Aldwell's visit, and had been working through it methodically ever since 12 loaves of bread, 4 varieties of preserves from the garden's yield, 3 berry cobblers, 2 dried apple pies, and enough cornbread to feed 40 people if the turnout was what Calhoun said it usually was. She'd also taken on the savory side without being asked a pot of beans large enough to baptize a congregation salt pork braised until it fell apart, and a beef stew that she'd started the morning of the social and would be ready by noon. She had not slept past 4 o'clock in 11 days. Dawson noticed first. He came in for breakfast one morning the week before and found her already at the stove with flour on both forearms and her hair pulled back tighter than usual. And he stopped and looked at the table already fully laid with preserves she'd put up the night before sitting in jars along the center and said, "Ma'am, do you ever stop?" "When the work is done," Elora said. "The work is never done," Dawson said. "Then I don't stop," Elora said. "Sit down." He sat down. But he kept looking at her the way the younger hands had started looking at her over the past weeks, with a kind of careful attention, watching for something they couldn't name, the way people watch a thing they've never seen before and are trying to understand. The social itself went well, better than well by most measures. The families arrived throughout the morning homesteaders, mostly a few smaller ranch operations from the surrounding territory. 2 or 3 families from town, and the food she'd prepared disappeared at a rate that left her quietly satisfied. Margaret Aldwell arrived with her husband and 2 other women from the town committee and moved through the gathering with the proprietary air of someone conducting an inspection. She sampled the bread without comment and the preserves with a slight nod that was Elora suspected the closest thing to a compliment the woman produced. What she did not expect was the conversation by the water pump. She'd stepped out of the cookhouse to carry a fresh batch of cornbread to the main serving table, and she passed close enough to the group near the water pump to hear Margaret Aldwell's voice before she could step clear of it. Charitable of Garrick, of course, taking her on. Though I imagine he had little choice the way she presented herself at his door. "I heard she walked 40 miles, another woman said. "She did. Which tells you something, doesn't it, about the desperation of the situation?" A slight pause. "And of course, Garrick always did have a weakness for strays. Eleanor used to say." Elora kept walking. She set the cornbread on the table, straightened the cloth beside it, and went back to the cookhouse without letting her stride change. She knew what the rest of that sentence was going to be. She had heard its shape in a dozen different mouths over the course of her life. And she had learned at some point she could no longer precisely locate that the women who said those things in that voice had almost never done anything harder than cross a room in uncomfortable shoes. So she let it pass through her and kept moving. What she hadn't expected was that Garrick Hale had heard it too. She was back at the stove when he appeared in the cookhouse doorway, not the usual appearance of a man passing or checking, but with a particular set to his jaw that she hadn't seen before. He looked at her, she looked back. "I need you to do something," he said. "What?" "Come out to the social." She blinked. "I'm in the middle of—" "Leave it." He said it without apology, but also without command, as a man states a fact he considers more important than the objection. "Come out for 20 minutes. Stand at the table where the food is and let people see who made it." She understood then. He had heard Margaret Aldwell, and this was his answer to it. She wiped her hands on her apron. She went out. It was 20 minutes, as he'd said. But in those 20 minutes, 3 families came to the table while she was standing there, and each of them asked about the bread, the preserves, the stew. She answered their questions plainly, and without performance, the way she did everything. An older homesteader's wife, a Mrs. Garner, with the hands of a woman who had worked hard ground for 40 years, gripped Alora's arm when she tasted the preserves and said, "Lord girl, you made this from that garden." And Alora said yes, and Mrs. Garner looked at her with an expression of complete, uncomplicated respect and said, "That's a good garden." Garrick Hale stood 20 feet away for those 20 minutes. He didn't look at her the whole time, but he didn't move either. September became October with the particular abruptness of the high prairie, where the warmth doesn't taper off, but simply stops one morning like a closed door. The garden had given everything it had to give. Alora spent 2 full days putting the last of it up, canning, preserving, drying the herbs she'd cultivated along the south fence, and when she was done, the cookhouse shelves held more preserved food than they likely had in years. She showed Calhoun the inventory list, and he looked at it for a long time without speaking. "This is enough to last until March," he finally said. "If I'm careful, April," Alora said. "I ordered extra flour and cornmeal last month through Briggs. It'll arrive before the first hard freeze." Calhoun folded the inventory list and handed it back. "Eleanor used to put up preserves," he said. "But not like this." She looked at him. He had the look of a man who hadn't meant to say that out loud. She gave him the same thing she always gave him when Eleanor's name surfaced: a moment of quiet. No reaction, no invitation to continue, and no signal to stop. "She was a good woman," Calhoun said. "Just, she got sick, and after that the ranch was different." "How long were they married?" Alora asked. 12 years when she died. They'd been trying to have children for most of it. He paused. "Garrick doesn't talk about it. Hasn't in years. But it changed him. The way a bad winter changes land, you can work it back, but it's never exactly the same." Alora thought about that for a long time after Calhoun left. She thought about it while she cooked supper, and while she cleaned up after, and while she lay on the cot in the small room listening to October wind push against the cookhouse walls. She thought about a man who had built every wall in himself out of a grief that nobody on the ranch was allowed to name. And she thought about how slowly, without planning it, she had started to understand the layout of those walls, where they were, how thick, which ones were load-bearing and which ones were just habit. She told herself that understanding a person was not the same as needing them. She believed it completely. Then November came, and with it, the moment that changed everything. It started with the smell. She was asleep. It was past midnight, the deep cold sleep of a woman who had worked 14 hours and fallen into bed without ceremony, when something reached through the darkness and pulled her upright. Not a sound. A smell. The particular smell of burning wood that was not the cookhouse stove, not contained and controlled, but free. Open. Wrong. She was at the door before she was fully awake. The sky to the north was orange. It took her exactly 3 seconds to understand what she was seeing, and in those 3 seconds, something in her head went very cold and very clear, in a way she had learned over years of hard situations to trust. The north barn. The big one where the grain was stored and 11 horses were stabled for the winter. She did not scream. She did not stand there. She ran. The ranch yard was a chaos of half-dressed men pouring out of the bunkhouse, voices tangled, some of them standing frozen in the particular paralysis of people who have woken to catastrophe and haven't yet found the track from shock to action. Alora pushed through them toward the barn without stopping. "Water!" she shouted. "Everyone who's standing here not moving, get to the water barrels, Calhoun!" Calhoun was already moving toward her from the left. His face in the firelight was the face of a man who had fought one of these before and knew exactly how bad it could get. "Horses first," Alora said. "How many hands do you have?" "6 awake. Dawson's getting the others." 6 is enough for a bucket line from the south trough to the east wall. That's where it's lowest I can see from here. "Send 2 men to me at the barn doors, the rest on the line." She was already moving as she said it. "Where's Mr. Hale?" Main house. Get him. She hit the barn doors at a run and pulled them open, and the heat came out at her like a living thing pressing against her face, her arms the front of her dress. Inside, the horses were screaming the particular sound of horses in fire, high and desperate and unbearable to hear. And the far corner where the loose hay was stored had gone up completely, the flame moving fast along the wall toward the grain storage. She went in. Hey. She kept her voice as level as she could make it, because horses panic from panic and calm from calm, and she knew this. Hey, easy. She got to the first stall, the nearest horse a big roan that was wheeling and throwing its head. She put her hand flat on its neck. The heat was enormous, the smoke making her eyes stream immediately, and talked the horse down just enough to get the stall door open and turn it toward the barn entrance. The roan went. She moved to the next stall. Behind her she heard men coming through the barn doors, and she called out without turning around. Stay low. Get to the stalls on the left. Work toward me. Don't go toward the fire. She worked her way down the line. Her eyes were streaming so badly, she was navigating mostly by feel and by the sounds of the horses, which ones were screaming, which had gone quiet in the worst way of animals past panic. She got 6 horses out before the smoke became a wall. She pressed her apron to her face and went back for the 7th. She was at the 7th stall when the beam shifted. She heard it before it moved, a creak deep and structural. The sound of something that had been holding and had decided to stop, and she threw herself against the stall door a half-second before the section of burning beam came down behind her, close enough that she felt the heat of it on her back. The horse screamed. She got the door open, got her hands on the horse's halter pulled. The horse came with her. She could barely see. The smoke was a complete physical presence, now heavy and hot in her lungs, and she was going on pure direction. The air moved from the doors. Follow the air. And she came out of the barn with the horse and stumbled forward 3 steps into the open yard and dropped to one knee. Hands caught her, 2 sets of them. She looked up, still coughing, and saw Garrick Hale's face close to hers. Not the controlled, careful face of the man at the desk or the fence line, but the raw face of someone who has been badly frightened and is still in the middle of it. How many, he said. She understood he meant the horses. 7 out, 4 more in. Left side back stalls, I couldn't... She coughed. I couldn't see. He looked at her for 1 more second. Something in his eyes she couldn't read and didn't have time to try. And then he was moving, pulling the front of his jacket up over his nose, going into the barn. She got back up. Her knee was wrong. She'd come down hard, and something had twisted, but she got up. Bucket line, she called. She turned toward the men on the east wall. Keep the east wall wet. Don't let it reach the grain storage. If the grain goes up, the whole barn goes. She took her place in the bucket line herself. Her knee throbbed with every movement, but she passed bucket after bucket and kept passing them, and kept watching the east wall and kept watching the barn doors. Garrick came out with the 8th horse. Then one of the hands, young Dawson, his face black with smoke, came out with the 9th. Then Garrick went back in. He was gone for a long time. Alora counted buckets. She counted seconds. She watched the barn doors. He came out with 2 more horses, 1 in each hand, practically dragging the second one because it had gone rigid with terror. That was 11. All 11. The east wall held. The bucket line held. The grain storage did not catch. The fire burned itself out in the far corner in the hour before dawn, leaving the north barn standing damaged, scorched along the interior left wall, the far corner destroyed, but standing. Intact. Usable. Alora sat down on the ground when it was done, because her knee had finally decided it was not going to hold her up any longer. She sat in the cold November yard with smoke in her hair and ash on her dress, and both her palms raw from the bucket handles. And she looked at the barn and felt something move through her. Not relief exactly. Something older and quieter than relief. The specific feeling of a disaster that was going to happen and didn't. Garrick Hale sat down beside her. Not nearby. Beside her. Close enough that his shoulder was an inch from hers. He sat down in the dirt of the ranch yard without comment. his face still carrying the smoke, and the raw expression she'd seen when he'd caught her coming out of the barn. And he looked at the barn the same way she was looking at speaking. 11 horses, he finally said. His voice was rough from the smoke. 11, she confirmed. Another long silence. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, that first pale gray, before the color comes, and the ranch was settling from catastrophe back into itself. The men moving slower now, the voices quieter. You went in, Garrick said. Before anyone. The horses were screaming, Alora said simply. You went in alone, in the dark. You could have... He stopped. She looked at him. His jaw was working that thing his jaw did when he was holding something in that wanted to come out. She had learned to recognize it over the past months. I knew the layout, she said. I'd been in there to look at the feed storage situation in October. I knew where the stalls were. He turned and looked at her, fully directly in a way he almost never did. Usually his eyes came to her and then moved away, never lingering, as if looking too long was a thing he didn't allow himself. Now he looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away. You knew the layout, he repeated. Slowly. The way a man repeats something when he knows it's not the whole sentence and is waiting for the rest. She held his eyes and didn't fill in the rest, because the rest wasn't anything she could say out loud. The rest was that she had learned this ranch the way she learned every space she inhabited, completely methodically, because knowing where everything was and how everything worked was the only thing that had ever kept her safe. The rest was that in 4 months, the Hale Ranch had become a space she knew as well as she'd known any space she'd ever lived in. The rest was that somewhere between the flour sack on the cot and the barn fire in the November dark, this had stopped being just a job. She did not say any of that. Get some sleep, Mr. Hale, she said. I'll have breakfast at 7. She pushed herself to her feet, putting her weight on the good knee. He stood too, and for a moment they were standing very closer than they had stood before, in the narrow space of a conversation that had said more than its words, and she thought he was going to say something else. He didn't. He stepped back. He nodded once. The nod that meant he'd heard something and was taking it with him, and walked toward the main house. Alora stood in the cold yard and watched him go, and told herself the ache in her chest was from the smoke. It probably was. She went back to the cookhouse. She built the fire in the stove with hands that were still shaking slightly, and she put the coffee on, and she stood in the warmth of the fire and breathed. Outside, the November sky finished turning from gray to pale gold. The Hale Ranch sat intact around her barns and bunkhouse and cookhouse and main house, all of it still standing, all of it hers to feed and tend and keep. She had saved it. She hadn't thought about that while she was doing it. She thought about it now. Then she got to work. Her knee took 3 weeks to heal properly. She didn't tell anyone how bad it was. She wrapped it herself the morning after the fire tight enough to work on, and she kept working breakfast at 6. Lunch at noon, supper at 6, the same rhythm that had held the ranch together since August, and that she was not about to break because of a knee that hurt when she put her full weight on it. She adjusted. She moved slower when no one was watching, faster when they were, and she leaned on the work table when she needed to without making it obvious that she was leaning. Dawson noticed. Of course Dawson noticed. He was 19 and observant in the way young people are when they've decided they admire someone and are paying close attention to everything that person does. He started appearing in the cookhouse at odd hours, not at mealtimes, but in between, when she was at the work table or the shelves. He'd find something to carry that she would have carried herself. He'd reach something from a high shelf before she'd finished calculating whether her knee would manage the step stool. He did it without comment, without drawing attention to it, with the careful indirection of someone who had understood that she would refuse direct help and had found a way around her refusal. She let him. It was the most gracious thing she could do in return. Calhoun came to the cookhouse on the 4th morning after the fire and set a small jar on the work table without explanation. She picked it up. It was a salve, the kind made from rendered fat, and dried herbs, the kind that ranch hands made for themselves when they were too far from a doctor to bother, and too experienced to ignore an injury. For the knee. Calhoun said, already heading for the door. Calhoun, she said. He stopped but didn't turn fully around. Thank you, she said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word and left. She used the salve that night and every night for 2 weeks, and by the 3rd week her knee had decided to cooperate. Garrick Hale said nothing about the knee. She wasn't sure whether he knew. He was not a man who missed things, but he was also not a man who spoke about what he observed until he had a reason to. She had come to understand this as one of the fundamental facts about him, that there was always more happening behind the flat gray eyes than came out in words, and that the words, when they did come, were worth attending to, precisely because they were chosen and not accidental. He came to the cookhouse for supper every night now. Had been, in fact, since the 3rd week of September, when it had shifted from occasional to consistent, without either of them remarking on it. He sat at the end of the table nearest the door, the same seat always, and ate what she put in front of him, and drank his coffee, and sometimes read from a folded paper he carried, and sometimes didn't read anything at all, just sat in the particular way of a man who has nowhere else he needs to be, and has decided this is a reasonable place to exist for an hour. She had stopped treating it as unusual, that she recognized was its own kind of change. The North Barn repairs began the week after the fire, when the damaged section had cooled enough to assess properly. Garrick contracted 2 carpenters from Crestfield to handle the structural work and put his hands on everything else. It was loud and busy and disruptive to the ranch's usual rhythms for the better part of 2 weeks, and Alora adjusted the meal schedule to account for the extra men and the earlier start times, and the fact that men doing heavy construction work ate significantly more than men doing regular ranch labor. She tripled the bread. She added a mid-morning meal, nothing elaborate biscuits and coffee, and whatever fruit she had preserved, because she had learned that men who got something at 10 were more productive and less dangerous at noon. Garrick noticed the mid-morning addition on the 3rd day, and appeared in the cookhouse doorway, between breakfast and the main meal, with an expression she'd learned to read as a question he hadn't formulated yet. They're working faster, she said before he got there. Full men work faster. You'll get the barn done a day sooner than you paid for. He looked at her. Then he looked at the extra supplies she'd laid in for the mid-morning meal. Did you account for this in the budget? I did. I shifted from the discretionary column. I'll show you the adjustment if you want. He was quiet for a moment. You have a discretionary column. Every good supply plan has a discretionary column. It's for situations that weren't anticipated when the plan was written. Pete didn't have a discretionary column. Pete didn't have a plan, Alora said pleasantly. Something crossed Garrick's face, not quite a smile, but the thing that lived in the same neighborhood as a smile, the slight shift of a man who has found something genuinely unexpected and doesn't know yet how to accommodate it. He left without saying anything else. The barn was done in 9 days. The carpenter shook Garrick's hand and told him it was solid work, better than what had been there before. Garrick thanked him and paid him, and the man was gone by midday. That evening at supper, when the table had cleared and only Calhoun and Dawson were still finishing their coffee, Garrick looked down the table at Alora, who was at the stove with her back to him. "The mid-morning meal," he said. "Keep it." She didn't turn around. "Yes, Mr. Hale." A pause. "Garrick," he said. She did turn around then, because the word was so unexpected and so small and yet so specific in what it meant. The shift from formal address to name, the particular significance of that shift in a place and time where forms of address were the architecture of social distance, that she needed to see his face when he said it. He was looking at his coffee cup. Not at her. His jaw had that working quality again. "You've been here 4 months," he said. "Garrick is fine." "Alora, then," she said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. He nodded once, still looking at the coffee cup, and pushed back his chair and left. Calhoun at the end of the table said nothing, but she could feel him not saying it very loudly. December came down like a judgment. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 days, and the prairie wind found every gap in every wall on the ranch, and Alora doubled the morning porridge and started putting dried chilies in the stew, because she had learned that warmth from the inside out was the only warmth that lasted through a working day in this cold. The hands came in from the morning chores, stamping their feet and blowing into their fists. And when they sat down at the table, the steam from their coffee cups rose around their faces like small personal weather systems. It was in the second week of December that the stranger arrived. He came on horseback mid-afternoon when most of the hands were out on the range, checking the cattle lines, and Alora was alone in the cookhouse, working on the supply review for January. She heard hoofbeats in the yard and looked out the cracked window and saw a man she didn't recognize dismounting at the main house. Tall, well-dressed by frontier standards, with the kind of deliberate movements that suggested someone accustomed to being watched. She didn't think much of it. Garrick had business visitors occasionally. She went back to the supply ledger. She thought about it an hour later when she heard raised voices from the direction of the main house. Not shouting, not quite. But voices with that particular clipped tension that meant something significant was being contested, and one of them was Garrick's. She had learned the cadence of his voice well enough to recognize it even through walls, the way it dropped rather than rose when he was genuinely angry. She stayed at the work table. It was not her business. She kept her eyes on the ledger. Calhoun came through the cookhouse door 10 minutes later with a face that told her immediately that it was worse than raised voices. "You know a man named Aldwell?" he asked. "Daniel Aldwell." She looked up. "Margaret Aldwell's husband. Owns the dry goods operation." "He's been buying land," Calhoun said. He sat down at the table without being invited, which told her he needed to. "Quietly. Parcels west of here and north. Been doing it for 2 years apparently, using the bank in Crestfield." He paused. "The bank that holds the note on the north grazing section." Alora set her pen down. "What kind of note?" "The kind Garrick took out after Eleanor died when the ranch was in a bad way. He's been paying it down steady for 7 years. There's 8 months left on it." Calhoun's voice was controlled in the way of a man keeping himself controlled by effort. "Aldwell bought the note from the bank last month. Didn't tell anyone, just bought it. And today he came out here to tell Garrick personally that he'll be calling it in full. 90 days. The cookhouse was very quiet for a moment. "Can he do that?" Alora asked. "The note allows it. If the holder calls it, the full balance is due in 90 days, or the land reverts." Calhoun's jaw tightened. The north grazing section is a third of this ranch's viable cattle land. Without it, the herd size drops below what it costs to run the operation. Alora was quiet. She was thinking rapidly, and without speaking the way she thought, when a situation had changed, and she needed to understand the new shape of it before she could figure out what to do. "How much is the remaining balance?" Calhoun told her. It was not a small number. "Does Garrick have it?" "Not liquid. It's in the land and the herd. He'd have to sell cattle at winter prices to raise it, and winter prices are bad," Alora said. "Bad." Calhoun agreed. She stood up from the table. Her knee was fine now, fully healed, no hesitation. She walked to the cookhouse door and looked out toward the main house. The stranger's horse was still tied at the post. Aldwell was still in there. "Why?" she asked. She wasn't really asking Calhoun. She was asking the situation the way she always asked situations. Not why did this happen, but what does this person want? "Aldwell has a dry goods operation. Why does he want a third of a cattle ranch's grazing section?" "Word is, he's been consolidating land for 2 years, Calhoun said. "Building something bigger. A supply operation, land, water rights, grazing, all of it running together. He needs the north section's water access. The creek runs through it." The creek. She had looked at that section in September when she'd been planning the winter water access for the livestock. The creek that ran through the north grazing land was the cleanest and most reliable water source on the property. Without it in winter, when the other sources froze, the cattle operation became a problem of logistics that was nearly unsolvable. She had been standing at the cookhouse door for approximately 45 seconds. She had already made a decision. She was not certain it was a decision she had the right to make, but she had learned in 28 years of difficult situations that the right to make a decision and the necessity of making it were two different questions, and necessity usually mattered more. She went back to the work table. She opened the supply ledger to the page where she tracked monthly surplus, the money that came from running the kitchen under budget, which she had been doing consistently since October by negotiating better prices with Briggs and cutting waste to nearly nothing. She had been setting the surplus aside in the household account each month, noting it clearly because it was not her money and she did not treat it as such. 6 months of surplus. It was not close to what Calhoun had told her the note balance was. It wasn't even a third of it. But it was something. And something combined with the right conversation in the right direction was sometimes the beginning of a solution. She heard the main house door open and close, boots on the porch steps, the sound of a horse being untied and mounted and ridden out of the yard. Aldwell was gone. She gave it 10 minutes. Then she walked to the main house and knocked. Garrick opened the door himself. He looked like a man who had just been told something he'd seen coming from a long way away and had hoped would miss him anyway. His face was closed in a way it hadn't been for weeks. All the small openings that had appeared over the past months sealed back over the walls, back up, and reinforced the flat gray expression that she'd seen on her first day, returned in full. "I know," she said before he could speak. "Calhoun told me." Something moved in his face. Not anger, not at her anyway. Something more complicated. "It's not your concern. It is actually," Alora said. She kept her voice level. "This ranch is where I work and where I live, and I've spent 4 months making it function better than it has in years. If Aldwell takes the north section, that affects the operation, which affects the crew, which affects the kitchen, which affects me." She paused. "So I'd like to understand the situation fully. And I'd like to tell you what I know about Daniel Aldwell and his wife, which is more than you currently know, I suspect." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. She went in. They sat at the desk. The same desk where he'd given her the supply account book in August, which felt like a different era entirely, and she told him what she'd pieced together. Margaret Aldwell's visit in August, the things the woman had said, and the things she'd implied, and the way she'd looked around the cookhouse like someone assessing the competition, the 2 years of quiet land purchases, the water access issue. "She came here to look at me," Alora said. "But she was also looking at the ranch, what condition it was in, whether you had anyone managing things properly." She paused. "I think they've been planning this for a while. I think they saw the ranch operating poorly after Pete left and decided the timing was right." Garrick was very still. "You think she's scouted the ranch?" "I think she's smarter than people give her credit for, and I think her husband does exactly what she tells him." "Yes." A long silence. His hands were flat on the desk, the way hands go flat when a man is controlling what they do. "The balance on the note is—" "I know what it is," Alora said. "Calhoun told me." She opened the supply ledger she'd brought with her. "I have 6 months of kitchen surplus set aside in the household account. It's yours, it always was. But I want you to know it exists, and I want you to know that I think there are other ways to approach this before you consider selling cattle at winter prices." He looked at the ledger. He looked at the surplus figure she pointed to. Something shifted in his face, something that wasn't about money. "You saved that." "I ran the kitchen under budget. That's my job." Alora. He said her name the way he had that first time, carefully, like he was making sure of it. "That's 4 months of your work in that number. It's 4 months of this ranch's money," she said firmly, "which is why it goes toward this ranch's problem. Now." She put her finger on the ledger. "Here's what I know about the Briggs credit arrangement and the spring cattle market and the 2 homesteaders west of here who've been looking for grazing access since October." She talked for 40 minutes. He listened in the way he listened when something mattered, with his complete attention, his eyes on her face, asking one precise question every 10 minutes that told her he was not just hearing, but integrating. By the end, she had laid out 3 possible approaches to the 90-day problem that did not involve selling cattle at a loss. None of them were certain. All of them were better than nothing. And one of them, the grazing access arrangement with the 2 western homesteaders, had a real chance if the timing worked and the negotiations went right. Garrick was quiet for a long time after she finished. "How do you know all of this?" he finally asked. "I pay attention," Alora said simply. He looked at her. The walls were still up, she could see that, but there was something in the gray eyes that she hadn't seen there before. Not the recognition she'd seen at the fence or after the barn fire. Something rawer than that. Something that looked like a man discovering for the first time in a very long time that he was not entirely alone in a difficult situation and didn't quite know what to do with the discovery. "The homesteader approach," he said. "Walk me through it again." She walked him through it again. He asked 2 more precise questions. She answered them. Outside the main house windows, the December dark had come down fully, and the cold pressed against the glass, and inside the lamp on the desk made a small circle of warmth that held them both in it. She did not think about what it meant that she was sitting here at 9 o'clock at night, working through a land crisis with a man she had met 4 months ago as a stranger, and now knew well enough to read the difference between his thinking silences and his refusing silences. She didn't think about it. She thought about the problem in front of them, which was large and real and entirely solvable if approached correctly. That was what she told herself. Walking back to the cookhouse an hour later, through the December cold, her breath making clouds in the dark. She almost believed it. Garrick rode out to the Hendersons' homestead 3 days after their conversation at the desk. He didn't tell anyone he was going. He saddled his own horse before sunrise and was gone before breakfast, which meant Alora found out from Dawson, who had seen the horse missing and put it together. She fed the crew their morning meal and said nothing about it, and went back to the supply ledger and told herself it was his ranch and his decision, and she had given him what she had to give. He came back at dusk. She heard the horse in the yard and kept her eyes on the stove. She heard his boots on the porch steps of the main house. She heard the main house door. She did not go to the cookhouse door to look. She was washing the supper dishes when he came to the cookhouse. Not at the door this time. He came in the way the hands came in, without ceremony, and sat down at the end of the table nearest the door and put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. "Henderson's interested," he said. Alora set down the pot she was holding. "Both of them, Tom and his brother. Both. They want grazing rights on the north section from March through October. In exchange, they'll contribute to the note payment, not all of it, but enough that combined with the kitchen surplus and the early spring calf sales, we can cover the balance before Aldwell's 90 days are up." She turned fully around. "That's enough. If the spring calves come in at the weight Calhoun thinks they will, yes." He paused. "It's close. It'll be close. But possible." "Possible," he said. She nodded once. She turned back to the dishes. The silence in the cookhouse was different from the silences at the beginning, not the silence of 2 people who don't know each other, but the silence of 2 people who have said a great many things and are resting in the space between them. "You knew Henderson would say yes," Garrick said. She kept washing. "I thought he'd be interested. He's been looking for reliable grazing access since the Mercer land sold last spring. The timing was right." "How did you know about the Mercer land?" "Mrs. Garner told me at the Harvest Social. I remembered it." A long pause. "You remembered a piece of information from a conversation at a social gathering 4 months ago and applied it to a land crisis in December." She could hear something in his voice that she didn't look at directly. "I remember things that might be useful," she said simply. He was quiet after that. She finished the dishes. When she turned around to dry her hands, he was still at the table, still with his hands flat on the surface, looking at the space in front of him with the expression of a man who is working himself up to something. She recognized the expression. She had seen it before at the barn door after the fire at the desk, when she'd laid out the homesteader plan in a dozen small moments over the past months, when he had been on the edge of something and stepped back from it. She waited to see which way it went this time. "Alora," he said. "Yes." "When the note is settled." He stopped, started again. "When the spring is done and the operation is stable." "Garrick." He looked up. "Finish the sentence," she said. His jaw worked. Outside, the December wind pushed against the cookhouse walls. The fire in the stove made its small, contained sounds. He looked at her with the raw, uncovered expression she had now seen 3 times after the barn at the desk, and she thought that each time it appeared, it stayed a little longer, as if he was slowly losing the ability to put it back where he kept it. "I don't want you to leave," he said. That's the sentence. The cookhouse was very still. "I'm not planning to leave," she said carefully. "I know you're not planning to. I'm saying I don't want you to. There's a difference." He pushed back from the table not to leave, but the movement of a man who needs a different relationship to the room, who can't say the next thing while he's sitting still. He stood. "You walked 40 miles in August with a flour sack and a notebook, and you fixed my cookhouse, and you saved my horses, and you kept this ranch from being gutted by a man who thought I wasn't paying attention." He paused. "I was paying attention. I just didn't know what I was paying attention to until it was already—" Another pause, shorter. "Until you were already in it. In all of it." She was very still. "I'm not a man who says things easily," Garrick said. "You know that." "I know that," she said. "So when I say that this ranch is different because you're in it, and that I am different, and that I would like you to stay permanently, not as a cook—" He stopped. His face had the look of a man who has walked himself out onto a branch and is now considering the distance to the ground. "I'm asking badly," he said. "I know I'm asking badly." "You're asking honestly," Alora said. "That's not the same thing as badly." He looked at her. She looked back. Between them was 4 months of early mornings, and supply ledgers, and barn fires, and December crises, and supper at the table nearest the door, and all the small accumulated weight of 2 people who had been paying close attention to each other for a very long time without saying so directly. "My husband was a good man," Alora said. "He was kind and he worked hard, and I loved him." She said it plainly because it was true, and she had never been the kind of woman who hid the true things. "He's been gone 5 months. I'm not going to pretend that's not recent because it is." Garrick nodded. He didn't look away. "But I'm also not going to pretend that I don't understand what you're saying," she continued, "or that I don't know what it costs you to say it." She set the dishcloth down on the work table. "I'm not leaving Garrick. Whatever comes after that, we can take the time it takes." Something happened in his face. Something she watched move through him like weather moving through an open place, visible, real, impossible to stop once it started. He crossed the cookhouse in 3 steps and stood in front of her close, and she was aware, as she always was aware, of the difference in their heights, the way he had to look down slightly, and she had to look up, and how in 4 months she had never once found that difference diminishing. He took her hand. Both of them looked at that, his hand around hers, the rawness of his palms from fence work, and the rawness of hers from barn fires and bucket lines, 2 people who had worked hard for everything they had. "I can wait," he said. "However long it takes." "I know you can," she said. He released her hand, stepped back. The distance between them was professional again, proper, the distance of a man who had said a true thing and was giving it room to exist without crowding it. "Breakfast at 6, he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "I know." He left. She stood in the cookhouse for a long moment, listening to the sound of his boots crossing the yard toward the main house, and then she turned back to the stove and checked the damper and banked the fire for the night. January was hard. The cold settled in with the particular malice of a high prairie winter that has decided to mean it, and the work became the specific daily labor of keeping everything alive. The livestock, the hands, the buildings, the stored food, the water lines that kept trying to freeze. Alora managed the kitchen through it with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, adjusting the menu for the cold, stretching the preserve stores with the discipline of someone who had planned for exactly this and knew the plan would hold. The homesteader agreement was put in writing the 3rd week of January. She sat at the table in the main house while Garrick and Tom Henderson and his brother James worked through the terms, and she said nothing unless one of them asked her something, and twice Tom Henderson asked her something directly about the north section's water access schedule and about the spring grass timing, and she answered both questions precisely and without hesitation. And afterward James Henderson looked at Garrick and said, "She knows this land better than most men who've been on it for years." Garrick looked at her. She looked at her hands. "Yes," he said, "she does." February brought the thing she had not planned for, which was Margaret Aldwell. The woman appeared at the cookhouse door on a Tuesday morning. Not the imperious appearance of August, but something different. Smaller. She stood in the doorway with her hands together in front of her, and the expression of someone who had rehearsed what she was going to say and was no longer sure it was enough. "I heard about the Henderson arrangement," Margaret said. "Word travels," Alora said. She was making bread. She did not stop making bread. "Daniel didn't know he didn't know I was aware of the full plan." A pause. "He doesn't always tell me everything." Alora looked up at that. "Doesn't he?" Margaret Aldwell's mouth tightened. There was something underneath the tightening that Alora read after a moment as shame. The particular shame of a woman who had been used as a scout in a plan she didn't know the full shape of, who had walked onto a ranch in August thinking she was gathering information and hadn't understood what the information was for. "I said things at the social," Margaret said. "About you. I heard them," Alora said. The silence between them was different from the silence of August, less weighted on one side. "The preserves you made," Margaret said finally. "The ones from the garden." She stopped. "Mrs. Garner has been talking about them since September. She asked me last week if I thought you'd teach a canning workshop in the spring for the homesteaders' wives." Alora looked at her for a long moment. She thought about a woman who had come to this ranch in August with condescension in her eyes and gone home with a report for her husband, and who was now standing in the cookhouse door with her hands together, asking for something that wasn't really about canning at all. "Tell Mrs. Garner yes," Alora said. "April, when the kitchen slows down." Margaret Aldwell nodded. She left without saying anything else. Alora went back to the bread. Calhoun found her in the garden in March, the first week when the ground softened enough to work. She was turning over the south beds, planning the spring planting, her breath still making small clouds in the morning cold. He stood at the garden fence and watched her work for a minute before he spoke. "Spring calves are coming in strong," he said. "Calhoun thinks we'll make weight." "That's good news. Note payment is scheduled for April 15th. He paused. "Aldwell's already talking about other properties. Word is, the bank won't extend him any more credit after the Henderson deal went through. Apparently, Garrick had a conversation with the bank manager in January." Alora looked up. "Did he?" Calhoun's face did the thing it did when he was not smiling. "Man's thorough," he said, "when he decides to be." She went back to turning the earth. The soil was cold and dark, and full of the particular potential that soil has in early spring. The sense of everything that was about to happen, compressed and waiting, needing only warmth and attention and time. "Calhoun," she said, "how long have you been on this ranch?" 19 years. "Did you think it would still be here in December when you heard about the note?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought it would be close," he said. "I didn't know which way it would fall." She nodded. She kept working. "I know which way it fell," Calhoun said. "And I know why." He pushed off from the fence. "Just wanted you to know I know." He walked away. She listened to his boots in the yard, and then there was only the sound of the garden, the earth under her hands, the first birds of March somewhere in the distance, the ordinary morning sounds of a ranch that was whole and working and alive. April arrived the way it always arrived on the high prairie, sudden and brilliant, and full of the particular energy of a place that has been cold for a very long time and is done with it. The calves came in at the weight Calhoun had predicted, and the spring sales were strong. And on April 15th, Garrick Hale rode to Crestfield and paid the remaining balance on the north grazing note in full. He came back in the late afternoon. Alora was in the garden. She heard the horse in the yard, and she kept working, turning the last of the spring beds, her hands in the earth, the April sun warm on her shoulders for the first time. His boots stopped at the garden fence. "It's done," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was standing at the fence with the afternoon light behind him, and something on his face that she had not seen there before. Not relief, not satisfaction, but something open. Something that looked like a man who has set down a weight he has been carrying for 8 years, and is standing in the first moment of the world without it. "I know," she said. He opened the garden gate and came in. That was new. He had not come into the garden before. He walked to where she was kneeling in the south bed and looked down at her, and then without any ceremony at all, he reached down and helped her to her feet. He kept hold of her hand when she was standing. She let him. "I said I could wait," he said. "However long it takes." "You did," she said. "It's been 4 months since I said it." "It has. Is that—" He stopped, started again. "Is that long enough for what you need it to be?" She looked at him. She looked at the ranch behind him, the barns rebuilt and solid, the bunkhouse with Dawson sitting on the step in the afternoon sun, the cookhouse warm and functional and smelling of the bread she'd left rising. She looked at all of it, and she thought about a flour sack and a 40-mile walk, and a woman who had buried her husband and kept moving because stopping had never been an option she could afford. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere and decide slowly without fanfare that it was a place worth staying. "Yes," she said. "It's long enough." He raised her hand and held it against his chest over his heart, the way a man holds something he has decided he is not going to let go of. His heart under her palm was steady and real. "Then I'm asking," he said, "properly this time." She looked up at him. "Then I'm answering," she said, "properly." The Hale Ranch in April was a different thing from the Hale Ranch in August Green, where it had been dust-full, where it had been hollow, warm in every room that mattered. And Alora Voss, who had walked 40 miles with a flour sack and a notebook and nothing else, stood in the garden she had rebuilt from neglect and said yes to the man she had spent 8 months teaching the meaning of partnership. She had not come to be saved. She had not needed saving. She had come to work, and she had worked, and in working she had saved everything worth saving: the horses, the land, the note, the ranch, and the guarded heart of a man who had forgotten that walls, no matter how well built, were never meant to be permanent. A woman's worth was not a question that needed answering. Alora Voss had always known that. Now at last, so did everyone else.